Hey everybody, Cole here from Classic Mini DIY, and on this episode we are going to be putting together the rear subframe, getting all of the suspension parts back on there, installing some wheel bearings, and putting those wheels back on the car, on the back at least. Alright everybody, so welcome to this next episode of the Bad Wolf Mini Build. In this episode, I'm going to be focusing mostly on the rear of the car. Now if you've been following the series already, you know that I've been kind of in the middle of doing some engine work, but I keep running into snags here and there. The most recent snag is related to the radiator and the fact that the bolt holes around the shroud are not holding bolts properly, and I can't get those to work, so I'm going to have to probably get a new radiator, unfortunately. But while I'm waiting for that radiator to come in the mail, I'm going to put together the remaining stuff on the rear subframe, get the wheels back on the car back there, and just start getting things kind of moving forward, you know, since I can't do a lot of stuff on the motor right now. Now, I did two videos, one on removing the rear subframe and then another on putting the subframe back in. Those videos should be popping up in the corners and they're linked in the description below. I would strongly recommend checking those out if you are doing rear subframe work and you're thinking about dropping it yourself. In this episode, I'm going to be putting the radius arms back on the car, reassembling the whole hub and everything with the wheel bearings and the brakes on the rear, as well as just installing the suspension components in the rear again. But before I get into this, I want to ask you guys again, I am really interested in doing another subscriber showcase video, and I posted a link in the last episode or the one before it asking for submissions, and I only got like 3 submissions. So if you guys want your cars featured in an episode, you know, post something up there. I'd really like to share a bunch of your cars and show people the variety of the Classic Mini there is out there and how many different kinds of Minis there are on the road. So that link is in the description below. Also, t-shirt design contest and intro design contest are still going on. You can check those links out in the description below as well. So with that, let's head out to the back of the car. We're going to start on the right side. And in my case, on my right-hand drive car, that is the driver's side. So let's get going. Okay, so before we get out there and start putting this stuff together, there are quite a few things that I find to be a lot easier to take care of initially before you put the stuff back on the car, because this way you've got it on your workbench, you can kind of just take care of it right here versus crawling underneath your car. First off, we want to put this back plate back on. Now, you can see here I've already pushed in a new knuckle joint, and this just has a plastic cup with a small knuckle that mounts on the top here, and then you have your rods that connect to your spring or rubber cone. So while you're working on this stuff, it's always a good idea to address this. This can be done while it's in the car, it's just a little bit harder. What we're looking at here is the post that the hub actually sits on. So the side that the knuckle joint is on is the bottom, and then we have a brand new back plate, and that sits down like so right onto this radius arm. Now, if you have a new back plate, it might be a little tight here, which is totally okay. But what we're going to do is run the bolts through here, pull that tight, and then we're going to add the parking brake cable on the back side of this. And so once you have those bolts on, the next step is to take your parking brake bracket and you're going to set that down on the same post that you just bolted in. Now this will need to sit on the bottom side of your radius arm. So keep in mind, bottom side with the knuckle joint. So we're going to put that on, put some additional nuts on here, and these bolts effectively get double nuts on here so that they can tighten this whole system down. All right. There you have it, parking brake bracket installed, and that comes down from your parking brake quadrant right over here. Now this also needs to get bolted down. Keep in mind that this one doesn't get bolted down to like 100% torque, and you're going to want to put a washer in between the in between the quadrant and the actual radius arm. Now the reason you don't want this like super gorilla tight is that this quadrant actually moves a little bit when you pull your parking brake up. So if that can't move, your parking brake's not going to operate correctly. But just tighten it down so it's hand tight, and this should be able to move nice and free here so that that parking brake can continue to function. All right, so once you have that bracketry on, the next thing to think about is whether or not you want to, start putting some of this other stuff on for the brakes and the different ancillary items that are on your actual back plate. In my opinion, I think you should. It's an easy time to go ahead and do this, so I always recommend just going ahead and replacing this stuff now while everything is out of the car and it's easy to access. Now, additionally, if you're getting a new backplate like I did, you might end up with a situation where you don't have this little adjustment screw nut thing here, and this actually goes in the top right here. So let's move this over here a little bit so you can see it better. But this right here, pointy end up, goes into this adjustment bracket, and you can usually screw this in by hand. Sometimes it helps to add just a tiny amount of grease in there, and that is going to help, things just kind of slide into place. Now, it's at this point that I generally like to run this all the way loose. So what that means is kind of driving it all the way down in there. That is going to make it so that your brakes will not be touching the drum when you put everything back together. Now, keep in mind, this is going to need to be adjusted once you get the drum on there, and you need to start kind of figuring out where the sweet spot is for those brake shoes. We can stick our little adjustment metal pieces in there. Now these are sloped in one direction, and the slope needs to kind of like go down towards the actual back plate. Now it should be pretty intuitive there how that works, but they just need to sit down in there so that they grab the actual brake shoes when they get set down in here. Now the next thing that you're going to want to do is take a little bit of grease, tiny little amount of grease, and rub it on these two spots and place it on the actual piston here. Now by putting a little grease on here, what this is going to help is just keeping the noise down on your actual brake system. This is going to allow the brake shoes to slide up against this metal portion without much fuss and just kind of back and forth. I do like to go ahead and put a little bit of grease on the ends where they connect to the actual brake piston or the brake cylinder. I can't remember what that's called right now. These little spots here for your adjustments, and on the other side here. All right, so once you've applied that grease or your anti-seize there, the only thing left to do is actually install these. Now, I've done this a couple times, but there is one video that I think is really great that shows in detail about how to put brakes on and how to service these brakes, and it's actually not made by me. It's made by a group called Steveston Motor Co. Check it out. They do a really deep dive into the brakes on the rear here. I'm going to time lapse through this and get these installed real quick, but strongly recommend checking them out. They have some great videos, and this one is one of those great videos. So with that, we have all of our drum and brake assembly reinstalled here. The next thing that we can do is carry this out to the car and start installing the actual radius arm onto the rear subframe. All right, so this next part can be a little annoying. It's not too bad, but sometimes getting these bolt holes lined up with the bracket here is a little bit difficult. Now, first off, let's take a look at the bracket. Now, this bracket that I'm using has a already stock negative 1.5 degrees of camber, or positive camber. I can't remember. It's a little bit performance oriented. They do make ones that are, actually adjustable, that you can change all over the place and make them just the way you want them. After having one of those in my car, I realized that I don't really care to adjust it all the time, but I don't want the stock angle on my car. I want something a little bit more aggressive. So I picked up these fixed brackets. Now, these are for sale on 7 Mini Parts. They are awesome. I've had them on my car for years. As you can see, I freshly repainted and got them powder coated by Method Coatings. A friend of mine here in North Carolina does some really awesome powder coating. If you're looking for something like that and you're in the area, check it out. His link is in the description below. But anyways, the way that this bracket lines up is actually kind of counterintuitive, but that's how it mounts up to the system here. And then your radius arm goes in between here on this pivot joint that runs the length of this space. Now, this is where it can get a little frustrating and a little difficult. Getting the radius arm with this pivot joint in here and then getting these bolt holes lined up is a job. You know, it's doable 100%, obviously, or the car couldn't roll. But you'll find that it can be a little frustrating at times. So what I would recommend doing is first starting off by greasing this and placing it into your radius arm. Make sure that you have this grease nipple pointing out towards the outside of your car. Before I took this off, it was actually pointing towards the inside of the car, which on the outside it looked a little bit nicer, but it made servicing these joints much more difficult. And this is something that you will want to regularly service, so access is crucial. Now let's go ahead and put this on the radius arm. I'm going to show you a few more things about this. Now the grease that you use for this should just be a synthetic chassis grease. I mean, you can use a standard conventional grease here on this as well, but personally I like synthetic grease. It seems to hold up a lot longer and it doesn't smell quite as bad, which is kind of nice. So after greasing this up, you're going to slide this pivot joint right down into your radius arm there, and it actually can pass all the way through. Like, it can continue to keep going out that other side. But after you put that on, you'll need to put these washers on. Now these are special washers. They actually have kind of a swirl ring on the inside. And what that does is it helps keep the grease on the inside and keeps it from going out of the pivot joint and getting loose and all over the place in your car here. Additionally, there are dust covers that go on these, and I don't have a dust cover here with me right now. And if I'm honest with you guys, I've never actually run them with the dust covers. I would recommend putting them on if you have them. However, that said, I've never run with them, so, you know, kind of make your own decision there. But if you do need a kit to repair this, these kits are available from 7 Mini Parts. They are really easy to put in, aside from one thing, and that's machining the bushings into your radius arm. That's something that a machine shop really has to do. So if you are looking to, you know, repair this or replace your pivot joints back here, which I recommend if you have it apart and you haven't done it before, you're going to need to engage a machine shop to get it all completed, you know, completely. Now, after you've put those washers on, you're going to lift your radius arm up into place, and I strongly recommend putting this bracket on the end of your radius arm so you can kind of start lining things up as it goes on, like that. Now to start off, you're just going to want to take one bolt and go ahead, and I usually like to start with this top one here just because it's the easiest one to get to. Run that bolt in. Now this part can be a little difficult. This is a job that is definitely easier with multiple people because you can have somebody kind of holding this heavy ass radius arm underneath you. This is kind of what I was talking about, this part. You know, you might find that that top bolt hole is a little difficult to get into, which is what I'm experiencing right now. Now, in my case, it was easiest to get the bolt hole that was on the bottom side in, and in the past, it's been the top one. So this is kind of one of those things that I was talking about where you just gotta get in there and do your best to find the way that works best for you. As long as all of these bolt holes ultimately line up and you get all your bolts in here, you should be in good shape. Alright, so now that I have all 4 of my bolts installed there, the next thing that we're going to want to do here, we're going to want to install the outer nut on this end here, and then we're going to want to install the inner nut on the other side. Alright, and so after that comes the fun part of starting to connect all of the extra stuff onto your radius arm. The first of which being your flexible brake line here. Now most radius arms will have a little bracket here, and this little bracket here is used for mounting this flexible line because this radius arm moves up and down, so your brake line has to be able to move up and down with it. Now this flexi line, you can get all sorts of different kinds. You can get really basic ones, or you can get the kind of like braided line that I've got going on right here. If you have a little bit of extra cash, I think it's totally worth it to get one of these braided lines. They last forever, and they're just stronger. So I did that just kind of loose. It's not super tight on there right now. I did that just sort of loose, not super tight right now, because we still have a good bit of other stuff we need to reconnect here. Next, you have your actual parking brake line. This is going to come through. You're going to want to set it into that quadrant that we were talking about earlier that needed to be able to pivot. So we can get that under our knuckle joint here. There we go. And there's a little notch in that quadrant that is made specifically for the little metal tab that's on your parking brake cable. And then this can be stuck on your parking brake bracket on the back there. I can show you guys that in a minute here. It's a little hard to show you at the moment. All right, so next up we have our rear shock absorber. Now we're only going to connect the bottom end of the shock absorber right now. If we connect the whole thing up right now, we're not going to be able to get our spring or cone assembly into the subframe right here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set this on the back post of our radius arm, kind of work that down as far as it can go. Now it might be loose, and that's cool, that's fine. And we'll go ahead and tighten that nut down enough to where the shock absorber is not going to fall off. Next up, we are going to take the kind of main part of our suspension system here. Now, as you can see, I've got a spring system here instead of a cone system. I did a whole install video on these. If you're interested in putting these on your car, I strongly recommend them. They're wonderful. They've been running on my car for about a year now, and I'm still very pleased with them. So we've got the red spring, we've got the Trumpet, as well as the actual post here that runs down to the knuckle. Now, I find that it's easiest to kind of do this stuff in pieces. Now, hopefully you guys can see this. I've kind of got this light, I've kind of got this lit up in a way that hopefully it's visible. But the knuckle joint is right down here at the bottom. We're going to take the open end of our post here and slide it onto that knuckle joint. Now, you might also notice that I do have my actual like back plate and radius arm kind of jacked up. And that is just to assist in this portion of the install process. It's going to lift it up into place and make that knuckle joint a little bit easier for me to access. All right, and so once that's on, you see the post here will sit and it shouldn't fall out at this point. And then you can take your actual Trumpet, and if you have a high-low, you'll notice this has a thread and a nut on it. That'll allow you to adjust the height. Mine is already adjusted to where it needs to be, and if you have the luxury of having it adjusted already, try not to loosen this up because it is very difficult to get back here and adjust this while it's in the actual car. All right, and so now that Trumpet is in here. I think the camera might have cut out. If it didn't, ignore that. But as you can see, there's not quite enough room for me to get my spring in there. And the way that I get around this problem is by having your jack here, and you can actually lower this radius arm. That's why you don't want the shock absorber connected. You can lower this to its almost bottommost point, and then you should be able to get that spring in there without much fuss. Now, while you're using this jack here, you're going to want to be extra careful not to over jack this up because it will bend the back plate down here, and the back plate is not meant to be bent. That's part of the reason I actually had to replace mine, is because it was bent. So now that that is in place, I'm going to lower this back down a little bit, and I am going to move the shock absorber up so we can actually post it up into the top of the tower here and then tighten it from the other side. All right, so there we have it. We have our shock absorber installed, we have our spring installed, or our cone, we have the post, our high-lows, and the knuckle joint. Literally, the radius arm is pretty much connected at this point. The only thing we haven't connected is our brake line, and we haven't put our new bearing on. So let's go ahead and put our new wheel bearing on, as well as the hub for this side of the car. Now for this part of the job, I strongly recommend getting some synthetic grease. Now the bearing kits that you can get do come with grease a lot of times. Sometimes they don't, so keep that in mind, but usually they do. I like to augment the grease that's there already. Just make sure that it is a high temperature grease. It is good for high temperatures, so that means it can be used on disc brake, wheel bearings, chassis, suspension, universal joints, CV joints, and other things that require a lot of high temperature movement. If you use the wrong grease inside your wheel bearing, it's going to fail. It's not something that is a cold running part of your car. It is always going to be hot because it's always spinning. All right, so at this point, we are going to be putting on these bearings here. Now, one side of my car had bearings that were in great shape. They did not need to be replaced, and it was this side of the car. So what that means is that our hub already has the bearing races in it, and the bearings themselves are in good shape. All we're going to be doing is repacking these with grease, lots and lots of grease, and then we're going to be pressing this on here. On the back side of the hub here, you place your bearing into the bearing race, and then you put a dust seal on the back side. It's actually very similar to the seal that goes on your oil timing cover, but before we do that, got to put some grease in here, so let's get to that. Now, if you haven't packed bearings before, the way that this works is you take this like large clumps of grease and you really want to press the grease into every single crevice you can. So like really, really press it in there and get it into all of those roller bearings. This is going to ensure that these roller bearings stay nice and lubricated while they're operating, and it's going to ensure that these things don't fail prematurely on your car. Now keep in mind, you're also going to need to do this to both the front part of the bearing and the rear part of the bearing. Go ahead and set that down in there. Now that is nice and greasy, just the way it should be. Next up, we are going to take our dust cover and put that onto the back of our hub. I'll show you that once I press that in. It's just a matter of actually physically pressing that in there. All right, so there you go. Dust cover's installed, lots of freaking grease, and we're gonna slide this sucker on there. Now at this point, you'll see it's loose, and that's because we don't have the front bearing installed yet. The front bearing goes in the opposite way. These taper bearings are the kind of more modern taper roller bearings, are the type of modern bearings that you want to put on these cars now. They originally came with ball bearings, but those ball bearings were not quite as resilient as these taper bearings are. Whenever you have this stuff apart, it's always good to just go ahead and replace it with a newer technology if it's something that's not, required to be original to the car, which in my opinion, wheel bearings are definitely outside the category of, oh, that needs to be original. Now, as you can see, this is a messy job, and it's just kind of the nature of replacing wheel bearings. Doing any real wheel bearing work is just going to be messy. The last thing that we're going to be setting on top of this wheel bearing is this bearing washer. Now, it has a step down, and that step needs to face inwards, like so. It's hard to show you because it's got so much grease on it. And then we're going to take our castle nut and wind that down on top of that. Now this is one of those parts of the car that needs to be torqued properly. If this isn't torqued properly, you're going to have a really bad time. Your wheel is going to fail on the back side here. You run the risk of your hub falling off, things like that. So we're going to get our Haynes manual. We're going to refer to that when we set the torque on this. So I'm going to do it hand tight for right now, get that down. So this nut needs to go down to 60 foot-pounds. Now on the front of your car, you're going to have a different torque spec because most of these minis have disc brakes on the front. If you have drums on the front, I believe they're still 60 foot-pounds. Double check your Haynes manual for that. But with the disc brakes, it's like 150 foot-pounds that you need to torque those disc brakes to. So keep that in mind. This is the lower of the torque spec. Now keep in mind additionally that this is going to require a cotter pin, so you are going to need to find the cotter pin hole. and it's somewhere around here. I think that's it right there. But you're going to want to find that hole and line this up. Now, my understanding with these bolts is that once you've found the torque spec, once you've torqued it to the correct spot, you are going to need to get it to line up with that cotter pin hole. And it may not always line up after you do that. Of course, some miracle, this actually lined up the first try, so that's cool. But sometimes you're not so lucky, and in those situations where you're not so lucky, you have to either loosen it back up, bring it back down to torque, and see if you've met the cotter pin hole at that point. Or I know a lot of people will not stop torquing until they line that up, even if it's over torque. I'm not really sure what the best and correct method is. For me, I usually bring the torque off, I unscrew it a little bit, bring it back down to torque spec, and then see if that line is lined up again. So just my 2 cents, that's how I do it. As you can see, cotter pin slides right through here, and we're going to want to bend that back so that this is nice and safely on your hub. All right, there we have it. And then the last thing you're going to want to do is check to make sure that that bearing is spinning. There's no grinding, binding, nothing like that. And then you take your dust cover and you're going to return it to the hub here, and that is going to help keep that clean and dry while you are driving down the road. And now you have one completed hub, your brakes are on, and the last thing that we need to do, connect the brake line, put the drum on, and then we can put the wheel on. So, pretty exciting. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that wraps up this episode. As you can see, we went through and installed pretty much everything on the rear suspension. Now, I only did one side in this video because it's identical on the other side. The only thing that is different between this side that I did on video and the one that I didn't is that the one that I didn't do has the fuel tank over the shock absorber mount. So what that means is that your fuel tank needs to be moved or out of the way if you are going to put your shock absorber back up and mount and tighten that down. So with that done, the rear suspension is ready to go. I can lower that back down once I get the front end the way I'd like it, and then the engine gets to go back in. Now, some of the things we'll be doing in some of the upcoming episodes are doing a quick carburetor rebuild on the dual HS2s that I have. We've got a lot more engine stuff in store, front suspension geometry, all sorts of other stuff, internal things, attaching your gear shift system. So there's still a lot to be done on this car, so don't worry, lots more videos in the future. Now, like I said at the beginning of this video, don't forget you can submit your car as a subscriber showcase car using the link below. That is a Google form. That's the easiest way to submit, but you can also send me an email at classicminidiy@gmail.com. Additionally, there is a t-shirt contest still going on and an intro design contest still going on. A big thank you, and as usual, a huge thank you to my parts sponsor, 7 Mini Parts, for providing the parts you guys see me use in this channel and on all of my episodes. If you're interested in any of the parts used in these episodes or in any specific episode, the links are always in the descriptions below. And by clicking on those links, heading over to 7 Mini Parts, you're helping me show 7 Mini Parts their sponsorship of this channel is worthwhile. And I get small kickbacks for the parts that you guys purchase for your minis. Additionally, a huge thank you to my patrons, Corey Mason, Ken Texler, Graham Korf, Zach Albert, Richard Schaefer, Tim Ackrell, Gilbert Smith, Brad Roselle, Colleen and Byron Gentry, my lovely parents. I don't know something like a butt or something, thank you. William Sisti, Nev, and Gary Snight. If you're interested in becoming a patron of the channel and helping me fund the videos that I do and helping me fund the projects that I like to show you guys, head over to patreon.com/classicminidiy and show your support there. Otherwise, that's it for this episode. I will see you guys on the subscriber showcase, the engine build, or some other Bad Wolf Mini episode coming up in the near future. Until then, though, enjoy those minis and motor on.